Grace had become invisible to the world around her, though her heart still beat with purpose every single day. She was a woman of 43 years, someone whose name people seemed to forget within moments of learning it. Her job at the recycling center was simple and repetitive, sorting through discarded items, placing them into designated bins, watching as society's forgotten treasures turned into mere statistics. Nobody looked at Grace twice. Nobody asked how her day was going, or whether she had dreams that extended beyond the warehouse walls. The rusty bicycle that sat in her cramped apartment had belonged to her father once, decades ago. She had found it in the basement of the building where she lived, buried under stacks of old newspapers and forgotten furniture. The bike was ancient, its paint faded to a dull brown, its gears seized from years of neglect. The tires had long since deflated, and the chain hung loosely from its moorings like a tired old snake. Most people would have called it junk, a relic fit only for the recycling center where Grace spent her days. But Grace saw something different. She saw possibility. On weekends, during the rare moments when the demands of her exhausting job released their grip on her life, Grace would sit on the floor of her apartment and work on that old bicycle. She had no formal training in mechanics, no YouTube tutorials to guide her, no expensive tools to make the work easier. What she had was patience, the kind that comes from a lifetime of being overlooked, of learning to find joy in small victories that nobody else would ever witness or celebrate. One Saturday afternoon, as she worked to loosen a rusted bolt that seemed permanently fused to the frame, her neighbors' voices drifted through the thin apartment walls. She heard their laughter, their mockery, their casual cruelty as they spoke about seeing her riding that pathetic old thing through the neighborhood. Their words stung, but they did not stop her. Grace had learned long ago that the opinions of those who did not know her were like clouds, present for a moment, then gone forever. She continued her work, her fingers bleeding slightly from the metal edges, her determination burning quietly in the solitude of her small room. The bicycle eventually began to take shape under her devoted care. She replaced the tires with salvaged parts from the recycling center. Wheels that were still strong, still useful, still full of life. She cleaned the chain with an old cloth and oil she had saved from a discarded bottle. She repainted the frame with remnants of paint that others had thrown away. Slowly, impossibly, that piece of trash transformed into something that actually worked. Something that moved with grace and purpose. Grace's life had followed a predictable pattern for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to anticipate something, to wake up with an emotion other than tired resignation. Her apartment was cramped, her salary barely covered her rent, and her evenings stretched out before her like empty highways with no destination in sight. She had no family she spoke to, no close friends who would notice if she disappeared for a week. The world had decided long ago that Grace was not important enough to remember, not interesting enough to care about. She had internalized that judgment, worn it like a second skin, accepted it as her reality. But the bicycle was changing something inside her, awakening something that had been sleeping for years. When she finally rode that old bike down the street for the first time in months, its tires rolling smoothly, its chain humming a steady rhythm, she felt alive in a way she could not quite articulate. The wind touched her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace smiled a genuine smile. She smiled because she had taken something broken and made it whole. She smiled because she had done this alone, without recognition, without encouragement, without anyone believing she could succeed. The neighborhood where she rode that morning was quiet and peaceful, winding through tree-lined streets and past small houses that seemed frozen in time. Grace explored routes she had never taken before, pedaling deeper into areas of town she had only seen through the window of the bus that took her to work. She felt like an adventurer discovering new lands, though in reality she was simply a woman on an old bike, riding through the same ordinary streets that thousands of other people drove past without truly seeing. That ride awakened something dangerous. Hope. And hope, as everyone knows, can be far more powerful and far more perilous than despair. 3 months after that first ride, Grace had established a routine. Every Saturday and Sunday morning, weather permitting, she would wake early and take her bicycle out into the world. She had become familiar with every street in a 5-mile radius, every park and pathway, every hidden corner of her town. The bicycle had become her gateway to freedom, her escape from the narrow confines of her apartment and her job. On a crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves fell around her like snow, Grace took a different route. She had noticed a narrow path between 2 old buildings, barely wide enough for someone to walk through, that she had always been curious about. Today, she decided to see where it led. She carried her bicycle, navigating carefully through the tight space, emerging on the other side into a world that seemed completely hidden from the main streets. This forgotten place was like stepping back in time. Old buildings crumbled gently around her, their bricks weathered by decades of rain and snow. Vines climbed their walls, green and alive, creating a strange beauty in the decay. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and forgotten treasures. Empty bottles, old coins, pieces of jewelry that had been lost and abandoned. Grace walked slowly, taking in the silence, feeling like an archaeologist in a tomb from another age. At the far end of this hidden alley, Grace discovered an old wooden garage, its doors hanging partially open as if inviting her inside. Her heart beat faster as she approached. Something deep inside her, some primitive instinct that had been dormant her entire life, whispered that she should look. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside the garage, covered in dust and spiderwebs, sat an array of objects that seemed to belong to a different era. There were old paintings stacked against the walls, their frames ornate and somehow elegant despite the years of neglect. There were boxes of leather-bound books, their pages yellowed but their spines still intact. There were sculptures made, of materials she could not identify, and jewelry scattered across a wooden table, glinting dully in the light that filtered through the dusty windows. Grace's hands trembled as she moved through the space, running her fingers lightly over the surfaces of these forgotten treasures. She recognized some of the names on the book spines, authors whose works were studied in universities, whose ideas had shaped the world. She saw what appeared to be original paintings, their canvases bearing signatures that seemed vaguely familiar to her, though she could not quite place them. She picked up a small bronze sculpture, feeling its weight in her hands, its balance perfect despite its age. Deeper in the garage, behind all the visible treasures, Grace found a leather journal bound in what appeared to be genuine leather, secured with a brass clasp. Inside were handwritten entries, dated spanning more than 50 years. As she read the words, her breath caught in her throat. The journal belonged to Marcus, an artist whose name she recognized from an old documentary she had watched years ago about forgotten masters of the 20th century. Marcus was a man whose works had been lost to history, whose potential had never been fully realized during his lifetime. According to the final entries in the journal, Marcus had hidden all of this deliberately. His paintings, his sculptures, his writings. He had done this because he lived in a world that did not value his art, that rejected his vision, that told him his work was worthless. But Marcus had not given up on his art. Instead, he had stored it here, in this secret place, waiting for someone worthy to find it. He had written that he believed one day someone would discover these treasures and understand their true value. Someone who had themselves been overlooked. Someone who could recognize beauty in broken things. The final entry was dated 40 years ago. The date made Grace realize that Marcus himself might no longer be alive, that he had been gone long enough, that this place had become truly forgotten, swallowed by the city and time. Yet here his legacy remained, preserved in the dust and shadows, waiting for her. Grace's legs felt weak, and she sat down on a wooden stool near the table, her mind racing. She had touched something monumental, something that could change everything about her life. The paintings alone could be worth thousands of dollars, perhaps hundreds of thousands. She was not an art expert, but even her untrained eye could see that these were genuine, that they possessed a quality that transcended the ordinary. She left the garage that day without taking anything, but she knew her life had irrevocably changed. She had wanted to feel visible, to matter in some way to the universe. Now, standing at the threshold of something extraordinary, Grace realized that her entire existence had been leading her to this moment, to this discovery, to this hidden treasure that nobody else in the world knew existed. Grace spent the next 2 weeks consumed by thoughts of that hidden garage. She could not concentrate at work. She moved through her days in a fog, sorting through recycled materials while her mind remained trapped in that dusty, treasure-filled space. She barely slept, lying awake in the darkness of her apartment, planning what she would do, how she would proceed, whether she should tell anyone or keep the discovery entirely to herself. On Friday evening, she decided to return to the garage. This time she came with a camera, an old digital camera she had rescued from the recycling center and repaired herself. She photographed everything carefully, documenting each piece with meticulous attention to detail. As she worked, she thought about Marcus. about a man whose brilliant vision had been rejected and dismissed by a world that was not ready for his genius. She thought about how similar their lives were, how both of them had been overlooked, undervalued, forgotten. She began researching Marcus's work online at the public library computer after her shift ended. What she discovered astonished her. Marcus was not just any artist. He was considered one of the most innovative sculptors of the mid-20th century. His early works had been exhibited in major galleries, praised by critics, collected by wealthy patrons. But then, after a personal tragedy, the death of his daughter, Marcus had withdrawn from public life. He had stopped creating new works and had simply vanished from the art world. The paintings and sculptures that were now stored in that forgotten garage represented the culmination of his life's work. If authenticated, they could be worth millions of dollars. Grace realized that she had discovered not just hidden treasure, but a lost chapter of art history itself. The implications were staggering. But as Grace sat in front of the computer in the hushed library, surrounded by people who were as invisible and forgotten as she had always believed herself to be, a profound realization washed over her. This moment, this discovery, this was not about becoming rich or finally mattering to a world that had ignored her. It was about understanding that she had always mattered, that her careful restoration of that old bicycle had been a mirror of her own restoration, her own transformation from rust and decay into something whole and purposeful. She thought about what would happen if she went public with this discovery. There would be lawyers and documents and tax implications. She would become known, visible, famous for having found something extraordinary. But she would lose the quiet grace of her discovery, the precious solitude of it, the knowledge that this treasure was hers alone, known only to herself and the spirit of Marcus who had hidden it. Grace made a decision that surprised herself with its clarity. She would not sell the artworks or tell the world about them. Instead, over the coming months and years, she would learn everything she could about Marcus and his work. She would restore and preserve these pieces, just as she had restored that bicycle. She would become the guardian of his legacy, the keeper of his vision, the one person in the entire world who understood the profound beauty of what he had created. But first, she needed to do something else. She spent her meager savings to hire an art authenticator, an elderly woman named Catherine, who had spent her life studying 20th century sculptors. Catherine came to the garage on a rainy Saturday afternoon, and as she moved through the space, touching the paintings, examining the sculptures, reading entries from Marcus's journal, tears streamed down her face. "My God," Catherine whispered. "These are authentic. These are priceless. This is the lost collection everyone has been searching for." She turned to Grace, her eyes filled with wonder. "How did you find this place? Where did you come from?" Grace smiled. That same smile she had worn when riding her old bicycle for the first time. "I came from nowhere," she said quietly. "I was nobody. I was invisible. And then I found an old broken thing and made it whole. And that bicycle led me here. It led me to understand that broken things have value, that forgotten things matter, that invisible people can find extraordinary things." Catherine studied her for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression. She began to laugh, not at Grace, but with her, as if they shared a secret that only they could understand. "You know what you're going to do with these?" Catherine asked. "You're going to create a museum, or a foundation, dedicated to Marcus's work and to artists like him. Artists whose genius was overlooked, whose contributions were forgotten. And you're going to run it. You're going to make sure that no artist ever feels as invisible and undervalued as Marcus felt, as you felt." Grace felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, but awakening. For the first time in her life, she saw herself not as an invisible woman riding a broken bicycle, but as someone capable of changing the world. Someone whose journey from invisibility to purpose could itself become a source of inspiration for others. Someone whose life, so long defined by absence, was now overflowing with meaning. Grace's transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it gathered momentum like a stone rolling downhill. With Catherine's help, she documented every piece in the garage, creating a comprehensive catalog with photographs, measurements, and detailed descriptions. They worked together in the evenings and on weekends. These two women separated by decades of experience, but united by their understanding of beauty and value. News of the discovery began to spread through the art world, but in a way that Grace had carefully controlled. Instead of selling the pieces to the highest bidder, she approached several small galleries and art institutions in the region. She explained Marcus's story, showed them his journal entries, told them about a man whose genius had bloomed in isolation and then withered in obscurity. She offered to lend them pieces for exhibitions, allowing them to celebrate his work and introduce his vision to audiences who would never have known it otherwise. The art world responded with astonishment. Critics who had forgotten about Marcus suddenly rediscovered him, exploring the lost works with fresh eyes and profound appreciation. Universities began studying his sculptures in their art history programs. Young artists found inspiration in his journals, in his philosophies about art and beauty, and the purpose of creation. The invisible artist had finally become visible, his contribution to human culture finally recognized and celebrated. But something equally important was happening in Grace's own life. With Catherine's encouragement and support, she began planning a small foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting overlooked artists and preserving works that might otherwise be lost to history. She used her modest savings as seed money, and she worked with lawyers to establish the legal framework. She named it the Marcus Foundation, in honor of the man whose hidden treasure had given her own life meaning. Grace left her job at the recycling center on a Tuesday morning in spring. Her supervisor seemed almost surprised when she handed in her 2 weeks' notice. Nobody at work had ever imagined that the quiet woman who sorted refuse would leave to pursue something grander. But when Grace explained that she was starting a foundation to support artists, some of her co-workers actually seemed genuinely happy for her, as if her departure somehow validated their own hidden dreams. The first exhibition of Marcus's works took place in an old converted warehouse, the same building where Grace had once worked with Catherine on documentation projects. Over 500 people attended the opening, filling the space with energy and emotion as they viewed the paintings and sculptures that had been hidden away for decades. Grace stood beside a large portrait of Marcus, the only photograph that had been preserved in the garage, and she felt him there with her, present in every brushstroke, every carefully sculpted line, every vision that he had poured into these works. Catherine approached her during the opening, carrying a glass of champagne that Grace had barely touched. "Look around," Catherine whispered. "All these people came because you believed in something that everyone else had forgotten. You saw value where the world saw garbage. You recognized beauty in decay. That's not something you can teach. That's something you have to be." Over the next year, the Marcus Foundation grew beyond Grace's wildest expectations. Artists began submitting their work, seeking recognition and support. The foundation received grants from arts councils and donations from wealthy collectors who were moved by Marcus's story. A documentary filmmaker approached Grace about making a film about the discovery and about her own journey. Local news outlets started calling her for interviews. Grace, who had spent 43 years being invisible, found herself becoming a voice for forgotten artists everywhere. But the most meaningful change was something that nobody else could see. It lived inside Grace, in the way she moved through the world, in the confidence that now radiated from her. She had discovered that visibility was not something given to you by others. It was something you created for yourself through your choices and your courage and your willingness to see value in things others had discarded. She continued to ride her old bicycle, though it was now carefully maintained and lovingly preserved. She rode it through the neighborhood where people had once laughed at it, and now when they saw her, they did not see a woman on a broken bike. They saw the woman who had changed the art world, who had discovered a lost master, who had transformed her own invisible life into a beacon of light for others. Grace had learned that every broken thing contains the potential for restoration. Every forgotten person carries within them the capacity for greatness. Every overlooked treasure can change the world if someone has the courage to believe in it. And she had learned that sometimes, the greatest treasures are not the ones we find in hidden garages, but the ones we discover within ourselves. 5 years after discovering that dusty garage, Grace stood in the renovated Marcus Foundation headquarters, a beautiful 3-story building that had once been an abandoned factory. The walls were lined with Marcus's paintings. His sculptures occupied spaces of honor, and his journals were preserved in climate-controlled cases for researchers and students to study. But more importantly, the foundation had become a sanctuary for artists whose voices had been silenced, whose vision had been rejected, whose genius had nearly been lost to the indifference of the world. She had hired a small staff, artists themselves, people who understood what it meant to struggle for recognition, to create in the face of doubt and dismissal. Together, they administered grants, organized exhibitions, conducted workshops, and created a network of support that spanned the entire region. Young artists could apply for mentorship programs where they worked directly with established professionals. Overlooked masters who had never received their due recognition could submit their work for documentation and preservation. The foundation had already saved the forgotten works of 17 different artists from being lost forever. Grace's own story had become as legendary as Marcus's. She had been featured in art magazines, invited to speak at universities, approached by producers about making a full-length documentary about her life. She was no longer invisible. The world had noticed her. But paradoxically, this visibility had not changed who she truly was. She remained humble, grounded, focused on the mission rather than the acclaim. One afternoon, a young woman named Sophia came to the foundation. She was exactly as Grace had once been, invisible, overlooked, forgotten by everyone around her. Sophia was a sculptor, but her family had told her that art was a waste of time. Her friends had dismissed her ambitions. She worked a minimum wage job and created sculptures in the evenings, alone in a tiny studio apartment, with nobody to encourage her or believe in her potential. Grace recognized herself immediately in Sophia. She spent hours with the young woman, showing her Marcus's journals, telling her the story of the hidden treasure, explaining how she had learned that invisibility is not a permanent condition. It is simply the absence of being seen by others, and it can always be transformed into visibility through persistence and faith in yourself. The world will try to convince you that you don't matter, Grace told Sophia, looking directly into her eyes. It will show you beautiful, successful people and tell you that because you are not like them, you will never matter. It will be wrong. Your visibility does not depend on the world's recognition. It depends on your own acknowledgement of your worth, your own investment in your dreams, your own refusal to accept the verdict of those who cannot see your true value. Sophia listened intently, and Grace could see something shifting inside her. The same awakening that had happened to Grace when she first decided to restore that old bicycle. Sophia would go on to become a celebrated sculptor. She would eventually donate her own collection to the Marcus Foundation. She would become the third artist in a chain of invisibility, transforming into legacy. Years passed, and Grace's life became a testament to transformation. Her apartment, once cramped and suffocating, had expanded into a comfortable home filled with books and art and carefully preserved treasures. She had friendships, real connections with people who knew her and valued her and celebrated her. She had purpose, a mission that gave shape and meaning to every day. She had visibility, not in the sense of fame, but in the sense of being truly seen and known and appreciated. The old bicycle still hung in her home, preserved like a relic, a reminder of the moment when she had decided that broken things could be made beautiful, that invisible people could change the world. Sometimes, visitors to her home would ask about it, and Grace would tell them the entire story, how a discarded bicycle had led to a hidden treasure, and how that treasure had led her to discover that the greatest treasure all along was the invisible worth that lived within herself. On her 50th birthday, the town held an official celebration in Grace's honor. They unveiled a plaque at the entrance of the Marcus Foundation, celebrating her contributions to the artistic community and to the preservation of overlooked talent. But what moved Grace most deeply was not the official recognition. It was the testimonials from the dozens of artists whose lives had been transformed by the Foundation's support. There was Marcus's great-granddaughter, who had come to understand her ancestor's genius and his suffering. There was a painter who had nearly given up before the Foundation gave her a chance. There was a sculptor who had been working minimum wage jobs for 20 years before his work was finally recognized and celebrated. Each of them stood and spoke about how Grace had seen them when nobody else did, how she had believed in them when they had stopped believing in themselves. Grace listened to these testimonials, and she understood something profound. The hidden treasure had never been the paintings and sculptures in that dusty garage. The treasure had always been inside people, the beautiful, extraordinary, invisible treasure of human potential that exists in every overlooked person, every forgotten artist, every invisible soul who carries within them the capacity to create beauty and meaning and change. As the evening drew to a close and the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Grace thought about that woman she had been 5 years ago, the one sorting through garbage, ignored and forgotten, riding a rusty old bicycle through empty streets. That woman was still there inside her, still riding those same streets, still seeing treasure where others saw only trash. But now, the entire world could see it too. If you are watching this now, if you feel invisible, if your dreams have been dismissed, if the world has convinced you that you do not matter, know this: your invisibility is not your identity. It is simply the world's failure to see what is already shining inside you. Your broken bicycle can take you anywhere. Your forgotten talents can change the world. Your overlooked potential is waiting to be recognized, starting now, starting with you, deciding in this very moment that your life matters, that your vision has value, and that you are not invisible. You have simply been waiting for the moment when you would finally see yourself. What extraordinary thing will you create from your broken pieces? Tell me in the comments below what hidden treasure lies waiting inside you. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of ordinary people discovering extraordinary things within themselves.